Welcome to the Deep Dive Podcast. Straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. Robert Johnson here.
And I'm Linda Miller. We cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Today, we're digging into some recent commentary on global economics and President Trump's actions.
That's right. We're looking at analysis from Andrei Movchan, founder of an investment company. We want to really unpack his views.
Exactly. Our mission here is to get a handle on his perspective, Trump's impact on the U.S. and global economy, international relations, especially Ukraine and Russia, and this idea of principles versus interests in politics.
Yeah, and it's probably important to start with where Movchan himself is coming from. He makes it clear he's not necessarily, supporting Trump.
Right. He's aiming for more of a sober assessment.
Precisely. He's critiquing what he sees as bias in the left-leaning Democratic media.
And he feels that bias has influenced the Russophone intellectual sphere.
He does. He thinks it ideally should stay bipartisan, especially asking, how relevant U.S. internal politics are to these global issues. And importantly, he reminds us Trump's only, 2 or 3 months into this term?
Good point. So early days still.
Very early. And Movchan notes that most actions we've seen so far are really more like declarations than actual fully implemented policies.
Things like tariffs, migration policies, the statements on Russia and Ukraine, those are mostly talk at this stage.
Pretty much. They're signals, intentions, but not yet concrete, finalized actions in many cases.
Okay, so what are some of these key declarations on the world stage that Movchan highlights?
Well, one big one is this idea that peace is better than war. Peace at any price is better than war.
How does Movchan read that?
He sees it as putting a stop to the killing first, then dealing with the complexities. He actually finds that reasonable, especially compared to what he saw as the previous U.S. approach.
Which he felt kind of sponsored the war continuing without a clear path for Ukraine to win.
Exactly. So stop the dying first, then sort out the problems.
Yeah.
That's his take on Trump's declared stance.
And interestingly, he disagrees with some Russophone voices who think Ukraine should just keep fighting, keep taking casualties.
Yes, that's a key point of disagreement he highlights within that community. It's quite a stark difference in perspective.
Okay. What else? Any other major declarations?
He points to radical Islamist terrorism. Trump's declared position, Movchan says, is significantly tougher, clearer than Biden's was.
And on Israel.
Open, unambiguous support for Israel in fighting terrorism. That's what Movchan notes.
And that's something Movchan connects with personally.
He does, yeah. He mentions his Israeli and Jewish background, so he aligns with that stance, while also acknowledging, his potential personal bias there.
Understood. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Economic policy. Movchan corrects something here, right? About who's behind the ideas.
Yes, he clarifies it's often misattributed to Peter Navarro. The main proponents he identifies are Stephen Mnuchin, the current chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and the economist Robert Trifon.
Mnuchin and Trifon. Okay, so what's the core of their economic argument?
The central idea is that the West, especially the U.S., has kept its currencies overvalued because it controlled global trade. And this, they argue, wrecked their industrial base.
So the dominance of the dollar, for instance, made imports cheap and exports expensive, hurting domestic manufacturing.
That's the gist of it. And their solution: rebuild that industrial base. Either devalue the currency,
making exports cheaper and imports pricier.
Right. Or use border restrictions like tariffs to kind of neutralize those price differences caused by the currency valuation.
That sounds potentially massive, huge implications.
Oh, absolutely. And Movchan stresses that Mnuchin and Trifon themselves emphasize this needs extreme precision, careful handling. He mentions Mnuchin even wrote a brochure in 2024, something like a guide to restructuring the global trade system.
So the idea guys are cautious, but Movchan sees Trump's approach differently.
Exactly. He contrasts Mnuchin's call for careful steps with what he sees as Trump's, impulsive use of tariffs without that deep consideration of consequences beforehand.
But he does see the logic behind wanting to bring production back.
He does acknowledge the rationale. He points out the U.S. import dependency, around 13% of GDP, which is actually less than Germany's 38%. And he mentions Trifon's point about steel production being tied to, national sovereignty.
So the underlying goal might make sense to him, but the method.
The rapid declarative way it's being done, that's what Movchan views cautiously, even negatively.
Okay, which leads us straight into the trade war itself. Trump slapped on broad tariffs, then paused, then hit China hard, 145% at one point.
Yeah, that sequence definitely shook investors, caused a lot of market volatility, as you'd expect.
How did Movchan react to that whole process, the sort of back and forth?
He wasn't a fan of the chaos, the unpredictability. He admits it's a policy approach, just not one he'd advocate for. And he clarifies, the tariffs on most countries weren't canceled, just postponed for 90 days. The big China tariffs came before that postponement.
Ah, right. So the strategy with China seemed to be
hit them hard first. Make direct trade almost impossible with those tariffs. Then sort of figure out the impact on the U.S. and maybe grant some exceptions later.
And investors, after the initial shock.
They calmed down a bit. The market settled back into a slow downward trend, which he suggests was part of a planned correction anyway. They used that 90-day reprieve.
What about the concern for, say, American pensioners, their retirement funds tied up in the stock market?
Movchan notes the market did recover to pre-tariff levels, but then he raises a bigger question about the market under Biden.
Suggesting that growth was maybe artificial?
Yeah, potentially unsustainable. Driven by too much money supply, essentially devaluing the dollar within the stock market itself, inflating asset prices. A monetary bubble, as he puts it.
So Trump's policies in this view are trying to deflate that bubble.
That seems to be part of the goal Movchan identifies. Reduce the deficit, cut government spending, shrink that bubble, and push money towards real production, which naturally means less easy money floating around.
And the uncertainty of a new administration caused some capital flight initially.
Yes, some money moved towards European markets looking for stability, perhaps.
So what's the key takeaway for Movchan from Trump's overall approach here?
The core point seems to be that Trump creates uncertainty, which maybe counterintuitively could actually speed up necessary adjustments. He's negotiating with everyone at once, not getting bogged down in endless separate talks.
A kind of shock therapy approach to trade negotiations.
You could maybe see it that way. But Movchan keeps coming back to his agreement with Mnuchin and Trifon. This needs extreme care. The risks are huge.
And is there potential for countries to just work around the tariffs, relabel goods?
Movchan thinks that's possible, yeah, like Chinese goods getting relabeled elsewhere. He also pushes back on the idea that Trump's inner circle made big bucks from insider knowledge on market swings.
He thinks that's impractical or too legally risky.
Both. Though he does acknowledge Trump's boastful comments after markets bounced back following his own tweets suggesting people buy.
So maybe some who just blindly followed his public advice did okay.
Possibly some small gains there, yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the tariffs themselves. Are they the end goal or a tool? How does Movchan see that?
He lays out two ways to look at it. If tariffs are the end goal, it's bad news. Higher prices, harm to economies, maybe recession or stagflation for everyone.
But if they're a strategic tool,
then it's more like a battle of wills, a test of endurance. And the U.S. might have advantages: less import reliance, economic power, the dollar's role. Exemptions and delays become bargaining chips.
And the ultimate objective in that strategic view, according to Movchan's reading of Trump,
Probably to force global tariffs down, but with other countries lowering theirs more than the U.S. does. So a net benefit for American trade.
Is that feasible?
Uncertain. Movchan notes China seems to be rejecting it. Japan and Vietnam may be more open. Then there's the whole Indo-China region possibly acting as a workaround for China. And Europe.
Struggling to react cohesively.
Yeah, European bureaucracy finding it hard to respond effectively, in his view.
How about China's reaction beyond just tariffs?
They've threatened restrictions on rare earth metals, which is a big deal since they dominate that market. Movchan calls it a beautiful gesture, a bold move, considering China's own reliance on U.S. markets.
He doesn't buy the narrative of China taking over as the dominant global power.
No, he describes China more as the world's industrial servant, still very dependent on exports because their domestic market isn't strong enough.
It sounds like his view of global politics is pretty stark.
Very pragmatic, yeah. He basically says might makes right. Nations act in their self-interest when they can. He sees Europe as maybe talking a prettier game, but ultimately playing by similar rules.
Which brings us to the risk of a U.S. recession. Is Movchan sounding the alarm bells?
Not really, no. He points out recessions happen regularly in the U.S., like every 6-10 years. It's part of the cycle. He makes a clear distinction between a normal recession and a major structural crisis.
And he doesn't see Trump's policies triggering a crisis.
No. Mainly because the U.S. economy isn't that dependent on trade compared to others. It's large, diversified, self-sufficient in many ways, and neutral on hydrocarbons.
He even suggests a mild recession could be good for the U.S.
In a way, yeah. Anti-crisis benefits, he calls them. Lower oil prices, slowing the rush of investment into oil and gas, maybe helping other sectors. He puts the odds of recession at 50-50, but crisis odds is low.
If a U.S. recession did happen, how might it ripple outwards?
He thinks Europe could be vulnerable. A stronger euro hurts their exports, and their economies are already a bit fragile. The UK, too.
But not necessarily everywhere.
Developing economies less tied to U.S. consumption like Indonesia, India might do okay. Oil producers would obviously feel the pinch from lower prices, hitting related sectors like, say, Dubai real estate.
And China.
Unlikely to have a recession, he thinks. Maybe slower growth. He's generally skeptical of their official numbers anyway and thinks they'd never report a recession due to politics.
So overall, no imminent global catastrophe from tariffs in his view.
Pretty much. He doesn't expect the tariffs to stay super high long term. And even if they did, it would slow trade, but probably not cause a full-blown global crisis.
Okay, let's pivot to the political and moral ethical side, especially concerning Ukraine. This has stirred up a lot of debate.
Huge debate. Movchan notes the criticism he's received from some exiled Russian opposition figures and some Europeans. They see Trump's potential policy shift as abandoning Ukraine, pushing Kyiv to surrender.
Basically echoing Kremlin talking points in their view.
That's the accusation, and Movchan pushes back hard against that. He calls those sentiments shameful and beneath dignity.
He emphasizes Trump's stated policy as what? Willing to support peace, but not those opposing it.
Yes. And he also notes that reportedly U.S. aid to Ukraine is actually continuing at planned levels. No major cuts seen yet.
What about territorial concessions? That's a huge sticking point.
Movchan acknowledges Trump's apparent view that Ukraine regaining all its territory is unlikely, given the lack of means. His perspective seems to be, why support continued killing on both sides if there's no clear path to Ukrainian victory?
And he raises the question of whether the U.S., given its investment, has the right to influence these decisions.
He does. The argument is, stop the deaths first, then negotiate. He contrasts that with just sending limited arms, which he sees as leading to a slow bleed, losing territory gradually, shrinking population, irreversible loss of life.
He brings up historical examples.
Yeah, border changes involving Germany, Poland, Finland, arguing that borders aren't immutable.
Why does he think Europe is resisting Trump's peace ideas?
He suggests a few factors. Inertia, maybe. Trump's confrontational style doesn't help build consensus, but also perhaps a European perspective that a weakened Russia tied down in Ukraine actually enhances their own security, especially given their limited defense spending and focus on social programs.
And the UK and France are seen as leading that resistance.
He mentions them as locomotives, but then questions how much substance is behind their resistance beyond just words. He doesn't see big increases in their military spending or massive new aid packages for Ukraine. Germany's promised air defense, not enough, in his view.
Okay, so if peace talks happened, what about capitulation? What might that even mean?
Movchan admits uncertainty about Moscow's real demands. NATO membership is off the table for now, regaining territory. Ukraine lacks the massive army needed against Russia's production capacity.
So a possible outcome is what? A frozen conflict?
And maybe an indefinite ceasefire along current lines with some symbolic stuff. That seems like a possibility he considers.
Does he worry this conflict could escalate into something bigger, a global war?
No, he doesn't see a global war happening. He views Ukraine as regional. Global issues, he believes, get settled geoeconomically now, not through massive wars.
There's still potential for instability from Russia.
Yes, he does worry about what happens if Putin's approval ratings drop again, what resources they might find, what actions they might take then.
What leverage does Trump actually have over Moscow right now?
Movchan thinks it's limited. The biggest lever would be a sharp, sustained drop in oil prices, like below $50 a barrel for years, maybe below $40 for 3-4 years. That would really hurt Russia.
And ironically, help energy consumers like Europe and China.
Exactly. He also muses about a potential deal Trump could have tried to broker with China involving an end to the Ukraine war as part of the bigger trade talks, but he thinks neither side really pushed for that.
Interesting. And what about these financiers popping up in peace talks, like Utkov and Kirill Dmitriev?
Movchan admits he doesn't have deep insight into why they were chosen. He knows Dmitriev slightly from past work, mentioning Dmitriev's background moving from private equity to a state-linked fund.
And he makes an observation about those kinds of state funds.
Yeah, that people valuing freedom and entrepreneurship tend to leave them because they're quite bureaucratic. He shares a little anecdote about needing to look busy at your desk.
So maybe Trump, being a businessman, just trusts other business people more.
That's Movchan's speculation. Entrepreneurs understand entrepreneurs, maybe better than politicians.
What about Elon Musk advising Trump?
Movchan sees that as logical. Musk supported Trump, and his achievements with SpaceX are undeniable. Trump seems to admire Musk's ability to organize, to innovate.
How does he describe Musk?
Visionary, maybe a bit crazy in both good and bad ways. He notes Musk's politics are quite far to the right, coming from that white South African background. But he generally approves of Musk's recent actions, like the budget cuts at X.
Okay, let's touch on the layoffs at places like Radio Liberty. Does Movchan see that as some kind of signal?
No, not really a direct signal to people in Russia. His take is more about accountability. These outlets need to provide value for their funding. He questions their relevance now, post-Soviet Union.
Given the current media world, and asks if they really succeeded in preventing Russia's slide back to authoritarianism.
Right. He compares their reach unfavorably to other outlets, even independent Russia ones. He feels for the people who lost jobs, but insists on the need for impact.
But isn't it contradictory to cut them while boosting defense spending?
Movchan acknowledges the seeming inconsistency. He doesn't debate whether the spending levels are right or wrong, just notes it looks odd. He allows that maybe these stations are seen as vital by some in the fight against adversaries.
Even if he personally thinks they've outlived their usefulness in their current form?
Exactly. And he adds the point about the U.S. seemingly struggling to even supply enough weapons to Ukraine, which adds another layer to the spending questions.
Okay, let's briefly touch on the Russian economy itself. What's Movchan's general assessment?
He stresses it's hard to know for sure, closed data, unreliable official stats. But his sense is that overall value creation is stable, maybe slightly growing.
Driven by?
Big growth in the military sector, obviously. But decline or stagnation in the civilian economy. Hydrocarbons are still key for extracting value, along with big infrastructure projects. Those three pillars essentially structure the economy.
And characterized by inequality.
Very high inequality, yeah. Few people owning assets, poor quality consumer debt. But he argues the state has managed wealth redistribution well enough to keep social stability, paradoxically helped by the war. Less risk of economic discontent now than before the war started, in his view.
He finds the economy surprisingly resilient.
Yeah, despite the war, sanctions, high military spending, he chalks it up to the war being localized for most people, a manageable defense budget relative to GDP, like Israel's, he compares, a population used to hardship, some social mobility via the war, and crucially, oil prices staying high enough.
What about the trend of nationalization we're seeing?
He sees it as a natural step for the current system. It demands more loyalty. State-linked managers benefit. He doesn't expect reprivatization later, why would you, when private property isn't safe? But controlling state assets gives real power.
So, a slow creep towards more state control, benefiting loyalists.
That's the trend he expects, creating a class of state-connected managers who control the flows, even without formal ownership.
This brings us back to that idea of principles versus interests in global politics.
And Movchan is very clear here. Only interests matter. If you want help, make it worth their while. If not, it's your problem.
He doesn't see this as new, does he?
Not at all. Millennia old, he says. His example is the UN switching recognition from Taiwan to mainland China once China became economically powerful. Most countries followed suit. Interests trumped principles.
Okay, so summing up Movchan's analysis, a nuanced view of Trump, seeing complexity in the trade war, pragmatic takes on Ukraine's situation and the economics involved, and a stark view of global politics driven purely by interests.
It's definitely a comprehensive, if perhaps bracing perspective he offers.
We hope this deep dive has given you, our listeners, a good grasp of his thinking, a shortcut to being well-informed on these complex issues.
Indeed.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.